There is a particular kind of Saturday afternoon in Birmingham in late November when the light goes thin and grey and the whole city seems to be holding its breath, waiting for winter to decide whether it's arrived or not. I remember that afternoon with a clarity that still surprises me. The way you remember the exact moment everything changes, not because the moment announces itself with trumpets or sirens, but because afterward the world simply looks different, and you spend years trying to recall the last time it looked the way it used to. I was standing on a wooden step stool in the bedroom wardrobe of our Victorian terrace in Moseley, hunting for the Christmas decorations. Caroline was at her sister Gemma's for the weekend, a sister's trip to the Cotswolds she'd been talking about for weeks. And I'd woken up that Saturday with a sudden and unusual surge of domesticity. I thought I'd get the tree down, maybe even have it up by the time she got home Sunday evening. A surprise, the kind of small, thoughtful gesture that makes someone feel loved, that says I was thinking of you even when you weren't here. That was the kind of husband I was. I want you to understand that about me first, before everything else. I was the kind of man who climbed up on a step stool on a grey November Saturday to get the Christmas tree out early so his wife would come home to something warm. The wardrobe was deep, the kind you only find in old houses, built when people owned more than they do now and had space to spread out. The top shelf ran the full width, packed with shoeboxes, old photo albums, bags of things we'd meant to sort through and never had. The Christmas decorations were in a large plastic tub pushed to the back right corner, and I had to shift half a dozen shoeboxes to get to it. I was moving them carefully, stacking them on the shelf beside me, when one slid sideways and something fell out from behind it, dropped silently onto the carpet below with a soft, unremarkable thud. I climbed down and picked it up. A Nokia. One of those older ones, the kind that still has physical buttons and a small, square screen, black, plain, the kind of phone you'd buy at a newsagent for cash without thinking twice about it. I turned it over in my hands. I'd never seen it before in my life. There was nothing unusual about that sentence when I first thought it. Of course I'd never seen it before. It was probably some old phone of Caroline's she'd forgotten about, maybe from years back before smartphones. People kept old phones around. It meant nothing. I pressed the power button expecting nothing. The screen lit up, still charged, still active, connected to a network. My stomach did something then that I can only describe as a slow drop, like stepping off a curb you didn't see. Not panic, not certainty, just a quiet, horrible readjustment of the ground beneath my feet. I stood there in our bedroom. The bedroom I'd slept in for 14 years, the bedroom with the blue-grey walls Caroline had chosen, and the curtains she'd had made specially, and the wedding photo still on the dresser. And I looked at that glowing screen. There was a text message notification showing. I opened it. The message had been sent 3 days earlier, sent from this phone to a number saved only as the letter M, and the words on that little screen, 8 sentences that my eyes processed in under 3 seconds. Those words did something to me that I don't have clean language for even now. They rearranged something at the foundation level. They turned 14 years of my life into a story I'd been telling myself while the real story happened in another room. He still doesn't suspect anything after 12 years. The house transfer goes through next month, then we're free. Love you always. I read it again and again. My hands, I noticed distantly, had begun to shake. I stood in that bedroom for perhaps 5 minutes without moving. I'm not certain because time was behaving strangely, not stretching or compressing, but simply losing its ordinary texture, the way it does in the moments before very large things. I was aware of small details with extraordinary precision. The faint smell of Caroline's perfume that still hung in the wardrobe, a cedar shoe insert I'd been meaning to replace. The angle of pale light through the curtain gap. My mind was doing something that I now understand is a basic survival mechanism. It was generating alternative explanations. one after another, each holding for just long enough to breathe through before collapsing under its own impossibility. Old phone. A phone from before we met, with old messages I'd misread. The letter M didn't stand for a person. M was something else, a category, a workplace contact. She still doesn't suspect anything. That was a misquotation. I hadn't read it properly. The house transfer referred to something she was managing for someone else, some administrative thing she'd mentioned, and I'd half heard. It meant something entirely innocent, and I simply didn't have the context to understand it. I read the message again. He still doesn't suspect anything after 12 years. The house transfer goes through next month, then we're free. The phone was 3 years old at most. It had not been sitting hidden behind a shoebox for the duration of our marriage. It was charged. It was active. It was connected to a network because someone was paying that bill right now, this month, this week. The message had been sent 3 days ago, which meant on Wednesday, which meant while Caroline had been sitting across from me at our kitchen table eating the pasta I'd made, she had been maintaining a second, active telephone with which she communicated with M about the progress of a plan she had been executing for 12 years without my knowledge. I put the phone down on the bed. Then I picked it up again. I don't know what I expected from the second look. Perhaps that it would be different, that the screen would show something else, that my brain had manufactured those specific words out of anxiety or paranoia or some stress I hadn't been aware of carrying. I'd read about things like that. The mind's capacity to misinterpret, to see patterns that weren't there, to construct narratives from inadequate data. Perhaps that was this. Perhaps I was constructing. The words were the same words they'd been 30 seconds ago. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Then I slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my back against the bed frame, the phone still in my hands. Through the bedroom window I could see the bare branches of the oak tree in the back garden against that pale grey November sky, and I stared at it for a long time without really seeing it. I thought about Wednesday. I tried to reconstruct Wednesday, not forensically, just as it actually existed in my memory, which was already resorting itself in the light of this new information. Wednesday. We'd had pasta. I'd made too much, and she'd teased me about it. Said I always made enough for 6 people, and I'd laughed. She'd been in a good mood. I could recall it clearly, a kind of brightness about her, an ease. She'd asked about my day, and listened to the answer and laughed in the right places. And on Wednesday, while I was boiling water and chopping garlic and thinking about nothing more complicated than whether to add the capers or leave them out because she sometimes said she was going off them, she had been thinking about house transfers, about logistics, about a timeline for the end of a life I didn't know was ending. His name was M. The message said 12 years, but we'd only been married 14, which meant that whatever this was, it had started 2 years into our marriage. 2 years in, when I was still convinced I was the luckiest man in Birmingham, when I still felt a physical jolt of happiness every time I came home to her. While I was feeling that, I opened the message thread. I want to be careful here because I know that what I'm about to tell you seems obvious in retrospect. Of course, I should have put the phone down, called a solicitor, said nothing, but you have to understand that when you discover something like this, you're not operating rationally. You're operating on a kind of desperate, addicted need to know everything, all of it, right now, because knowledge feels like control even when it isn't. So I scrolled. I read every message I could find, going back 8 months, the earliest the phone's storage held. The first message I read that had been sent to her, from M, was dated 8 months ago, in March. It read, "Meeting pushed to the 14th. Solicitor needs the updated figures. How are things your end?" And her reply from this phone, "Fine. He doesn't watch the accounts closely enough. Should have another transfer done by end of month." She had typed that. Caroline, who I knew, the woman whose reading glasses I'd found prescription updates for, whose mother's death I'd held her through, whose career setbacks I'd sat beside her through at kitchen tables at 2 in the morning. She had typed, "He doesn't watch the accounts closely enough," as a casual mid-conversation observation. The way you might note that the traffic was light on the Alcester Road, the way you'd say it's a bit warmer today. I scrolled forward. I was trying to read systematically, trying to take it in as information rather than as feeling. It was a useful fiction for about 4 minutes. There were messages about a flat, references to when it would be ready, who held the tenancy, whether it was in the right name. I understood that he, Marcus M., had somewhere for them to go when the time came. This wasn't a fantasy about a future. This was logistics, fully operational, months from its scheduled completion. There were messages about me. I'll be honest with you. Those were the ones that required the most from me. Not the financial planning messages, not the house discussions. Those were betrayals of trust, and they were monstrous, but they had the quality of information, of facts I could process. The messages about me were a different species entirely. One from her, from June. "He's been so quiet lately. I think he's finally given up trying to get me to do things with him. This is actually making it easier." He'd replied, "Good. Better for you both in the long run." She'd written back, "I almost feel bad. Almost. I sat on that bedroom floor with that message on the screen for a very long time. He's been so quiet lately." The quiet she was describing. I knew exactly what she meant. It was the summer I'd started giving her more space because she'd seemed preoccupied, and I'd thought she needed room, thought she was dealing with something she wasn't ready to talk about, thought the kindest thing was to not crowd her. I'd been proud of myself quietly for that restraint, for reading her correctly, for being the kind of husband who understood that love sometimes meant not asking. She had read that as him finally giving up. There was a message from April where she described a trip I'd suggested to Edinburgh, a weekend away, a city I'd always wanted to show her, as I've been putting him off for months on the Edinburgh thing, not worth stirring things up right now. And his reply, "Smart. Just keep things stable until the transfer, then it doesn't matter." I remembered that conversation about Edinburgh. We'd been in the kitchen. I'd pulled up some hotel options on my laptop, and she'd glanced at them and said something about timing, something about being busy, something that wasn't yes but wasn't quite no, and I'd said we could talk about it later, and then we never had, and I'd thought she'd just not been feeling it, and I'd let it go because I wasn't the sort of man who pushed. I had been managed. That was the word that surfaced in my mind with cold, specific clarity as I read. Managed. Every hesitation she'd shown, every gentle deflection, every moment of apparently needing space or being too busy or suggesting another time, all of it had been strategic, calibrated, timed to the execution of a plan I hadn't known existed. I had interpreted management as marriage and called it love. A message from February of that year, nearly 10 months before I found the phone, from M. "Are you sure?" Last chance to reconsider. And her reply, "I've been sure for years. I'm just waiting for the right conditions. I've been sure for years." I don't know how to describe what those words did to me. I had thought, in the hours since finding the phone, that each new thing I read would hurt me less than the last, that you could only sustain a certain level of shock before it plateaued into numbness. I was wrong. Some messages had a particular quality of precision to them, a blade sharpness, and I've been sure for years had that quality completely. While I was not sure, while I was entirely sure in the other direction, sure that this was the life I'd chosen and would keep choosing, sure that whatever the difficulties, whatever the distance that sometimes opened between us, we were fundamentally, definitively permanent. I had been sure of us in the unexamined way you're sure of the air, the way you're sure of things so foundational you forget they could be questioned. She had been sure, for years, of the opposite. Plans. There were plans. That's the word that kept surfacing as I read, as the light outside slowly shifted from grey to darker grey. This wasn't a secret love affair, or rather it was, but it was so much more than that. It was a project, a meticulous, carefully staged dismantling of our shared life, planned across months of messages between my wife and a man named Marcus. There were discussions about timelines, about when it would be safe to move money without triggering my attention. There were references to sorting the assets, to getting the house sorted, to waiting until it's clean before making the move. There was the casual, matter-of-fact language of two people who had been planning this for so long it had stopped feeling like a betrayal to them and had become simply logistics. I found the messages about the savings withdrawals, references to making them small enough, spread across enough weeks that I wouldn't notice. 43. Zone 0. I did the math while I sat there on the floor. 6 months, small enough increments, smart enough spacing. She had been right that I hadn't noticed. I paid our joint accounts enough attention to know broadly what was there, but not enough to catch the pattern of small, regular withdrawals. She had known that about me. She had used it. I found the messages about the house. My house. The 4-bedroom Victorian terrace I'd bought before we even met. The house I'd paid for with a decade of careful saving. The house that was supposed to be mine alone. There were messages about it going into joint names, about the transfer paperwork, about waiting for the right moment. And then I remembered. I remembered an evening 6 months ago. I was watching a match. Birmingham City playing at St Andrews, half focused on the screen, and Caroline had come in with a stack of papers, all house insurance stuff she'd said, just renewals, they need your signature by Monday. I'd signed without reading them properly. I remembered thinking vaguely that I should look them over properly later. I never had. My signature, my complete, utter, astonishing blindness. The bedroom was almost dark by the time I stopped reading. I hadn't turned a light on. I sat in the gathering dark in the house I was apparently about to lose, and I held a phone that didn't belong to me, and I felt something I can only describe as the physical sensation of a story ending. Not dramatically, not with explosions, just quietly. The way a fire goes out when it runs out of fuel. One moment there is something, and then there isn't. I checked our joint accounts on my laptop that evening. I didn't sleep. I found the house transfer paperwork in the filing cabinet in the 2nd bedroom, the one we used as a study, filed neatly between other documents, where I'd never have looked without knowing what I was looking for. I sat at the desk in that room until almost 3 in the morning, reading things I should have read before, understanding arrangements I had never questioned, seeing the architecture of the last 6 months laid out in front of me with the cold, organized efficiency of someone who had been planning this for a very long time. Sunday passed. I don't remember Sunday clearly. I know I didn't eat. I know I sat in different rooms of the house at different hours, trying to figure out who I was in relation to what I now knew. I kept looking at objects, the kitchen table she'd chosen, the curtains, the painting in the hallway she'd bought at a market in the jewelry quarter, and trying to understand what they meant now, whether they'd ever meant what I thought they meant. I remember standing in the kitchen at around 8 in the morning with a mug of tea I hadn't drunk, looking at the table. It was a refectory table, pine, large enough for 6, something she'd found at an estate sale near Pershore 3 years into our marriage, and been elated about. She'd spent a weekend stripping and waxing it. I remembered that weekend clearly. Her in old jeans and a shirt she didn't mind ruining, hair up, genuinely absorbed in the work, and I'd brought her tea and she'd looked up at me with that particular expression she had, like everything was exactly where she wanted it. I had loved her so much in that moment. I had thought, this is it, this is the whole of what I want. And now I stood at that table and tried to locate in the memory something that was still mine. Whether I'd been right to love her in that moment. Whether the love had been real, even if the life around it hadn't been. Whether a feeling can be true when the context is false. I didn't have answers to any of those questions. I still don't entirely. Around midday, her phone rang in my pocket. The real phone. The one I'd been carrying because I didn't know what else to do with it and couldn't put it back where I'd found it. It was Gemma calling. Probably the two of them coordinating the drive back from the Cotswolds. I looked at the screen for 3 rings and then let it go to voicemail. The idea of speaking to anyone connected to Caroline in that moment felt as impossible as speaking in a language I hadn't learned yet. I walked through the house in the afternoon, not aimlessly. I was doing something specific, though I couldn't have articulated it at the time. I was saying goodbye, I think. I understand that now. Some part of me had already understood on Saturday night that I was never going to live in this house the same way again, and so on Sunday I was doing what people do with places they're leaving. I touched the door frames. I stood in each room. I went into the garden and stood under the oak tree, whose branches I'd watched through the bedroom window the night before, and I looked back at the house from outside, the Victorian brick, the painted sash windows, the kitchen light I'd left on, and I felt something that was more complex than grief. It was the sensation of a life being perceived with full clarity at the exact moment it was ending. I did one other thing on Sunday that I haven't told anyone, because it sits in a category of things that felt necessary at the time and would be difficult to explain. I went to our photo albums, the physical ones, the pre-digital ones from the early years of our marriage, and I sat on the living room floor with all of them, and I went through them from the beginning, not looking for evidence of deception, not looking for signs I'd missed. I was looking for myself, the young man in those photographs, 32, 33, newly married, standing with his arm around this woman who had apparently never truly loved him. I wanted to see him clearly, wanted to understand what he'd thought he was doing and whether he'd been right about any of it at all. He'd looked happy. That was the hardest part. Not performed happy, not constructed happy, actually genuinely, unmistakably happy. The kind of happiness that doesn't know what it doesn't know, and that might be the purest kind, except that standing on the other side of it, I couldn't feel anything but sorry for him. I put the albums back on the shelf. I made myself eat something. Toast, I think, standing at the kitchen counter. And then I sat and waited for headlights in the front window. When I heard her key in the front door on Sunday evening, I was sitting in the kitchen with the lights on, a cup of tea gone cold in front of me. I'd made a decision during those 2 days of solitude, a decision that surprised me with its steadiness. I wasn't going to collapse. I wasn't going to plead or rage or weep. I was going to ask, calmly, clearly, what was true. I was going to give her the chance to explain, though some part of me already understood there was nothing that could be explained into acceptability. She came in with her overnight bag, dropping it by the stairs in that easy, familiar way she had. She was wearing a blue coat, her dark hair loosened from whatever she'd had it pinned up in, cheeks flushed from the cold outside. She looked beautiful. She always had. I had never stopped finding her beautiful, even after all those years. I think that's the part I find hardest to think about now. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that I was still in love with her. That I sat in that kitchen loving her while she took off her coat and called out that she was home. Monday morning felt more appropriate for what I had to say. I waited. I slept barely at all, but I waited, and Monday morning, before I would normally leave for work, I sat across the kitchen table from her with the Nokia between us, and I watched her face. She saw the phone and she went very still. I want you to notice what she didn't do, because I've thought about this a great deal in the years since. She didn't go pale. She didn't start crying, didn't reach for an explanation or an apology. The stillness that came over her wasn't the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of someone recalibrating. I watched her make a decision in the space of about 3 seconds, watched something in her face settle into a kind of resolution. And I understood then that whatever was coming next, she'd prepared for it. I'd prepared too in my way. Not for the specific content of what she might say, I couldn't have predicted that, but for the shape of my own response to it. I'd spent Sunday understanding that I needed to hear the truth, that I would ask for it directly, and that however it arrived, I would not respond with a loss of control that would give her something to manage instead of something to answer for. I owed that to myself. Not the calmness born of indifference, the calmness born of understanding exactly who I was and what I deserved. She looked at the phone. She looked at me. I said, "I found it in the wardrobe. I've read the messages. I want you to tell me his name. Tell me how long. Tell me what you plan to do with my house." She was quiet for a moment. I watched her face perform a series of rapid, subtle adjustments. The slight tensing of the jaw, a brief focusing of the eyes. The way people look when they're deciding how much to admit and in what order and with what framing. I recognized it in retrospect as the expression of someone who had rehearsed variations of this conversation and was now selecting the appropriate one. She said, "His name is Marcus." She said it in the tone of someone giving a deposition. Calm, factual, eyes somewhere to the left of my face. I said, "Marcus, what?" She told me, a surname I hadn't heard before. Common enough that it wouldn't have meant anything to me even if I had. I repeated it back to her once, because I had found that doing that, repeating things back, helped me stay inside the conversation rather than disappearing into what the words meant. I said, "How long?" She looked at the table, and then back at me. And this is the moment where I saw something that I carry now as a different kind of wound than the practical ones. She looked at me with something adjacent to pity. Not the pity of someone who regrets what they've done. The pity of someone who has outgrown a situation and is sorry genuinely, in an abstract way, that the situation feels pain. It was the pity you'd have for a child who's upset about something it doesn't have the capacity to fully understand. She said, "A long time, David." I said, 12 years. The message said 12 years. She nodded. 2 years into our marriage. 2 years in, you began this. She didn't answer that. She looked at the table again. I said, "The savings, the house transfer." She said, "The house was always going to be half mine. We've been married 14 years. The savings were half mine." I said, "The house was mine before we married. You know that. The savings were joint because I trusted you." She looked at me then with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, or rather, and this is the thing that settled into me most completely, an expression I now realized I had seen before, but misread. It was the expression of someone who knows they are correct and has stopped finding the discussion interesting. She had worn it in arguments. I had interpreted it as frustration. What it had actually been all along was the expression of someone who simply didn't rate the opposition. I said her name. She put her coffee mug down on the counter. She looked at me across the kitchen of our home. The kitchen where I'd made her tea for 14 years, where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, where I'd held her when her mother was diagnosed, and when her business failed, and when she cried at 3 a.m. for reasons she couldn't articulate. And she said 8 words that I have carried inside me like shrapnel ever since. "You were always just a placeholder, David, a comfortable placeholder. I need you to sit with that for a moment. I need you to really hear it. Not the cruelty of it, though there was that, but the specificity. Not you're not the one, or this isn't working, or I've fallen out of love with you, all of which would have been devastating in their own ways." She said placeholder, as though I had never been real to her, as though 14 years of my life, 14 years of my love and care and sacrifice and presence, had been nothing more than me keeping a seat warm in a waiting room while she waited for something better to arrive. A placeholder. My chest did something in that moment that I can only describe as collapsing inward. Not dramatically. I didn't buckle or gasp. Outwardly, I think I barely moved. But inside, something gave way, something structural, something that had been holding up the architecture of who I understood myself to be. I could feel it go. She didn't stay long after that. She made a call on her real phone, her legitimate phone, while I was still sitting at the kitchen table. The following week, a solicitor's letter arrived. She had been planning this part too, of course, had a solicitor already briefed, already ready. The machine was already in motion. I was the last one to know it had started. I called a solicitor of my own. He was a decent man, honest to the point of being painful, and he laid out my situation with the gentle clarity of someone who has had to deliver bad news often enough to know that false hope doesn't help anyone. The house transfer I'd unknowingly signed was legally valid. My signature was my signature, regardless of the circumstances under which it had been obtained. Proving coercion or deception in the signing of a document I'd had every opportunity to read was not an easy case to make. Caroline was entitled to half the house's value, $287,500. The judge, hearing about the lifestyle she'd maintained throughout our marriage during her various career transitions, awarded her spousal maintenance of $200 per month for 3 years. I remember sitting in my solicitor's office on a Tuesday afternoon, grey Birmingham light coming through the sash windows, the distant sound of traffic on the street below, and doing the math in my head while he talked. The money already withdrawn, 43 run sounds. The house settlement, 287,500. The monthly maintenance over 3 years. I had believed, in the careful, organized way I believed most things, that I was financially secure. Not wealthy, not spectacular, but secure, stable. The kind of financial stability that comes from decades of steady work and careful living. It was gone. Functionally, substantially gone, in a process that moved with frightening speed, as though the machinery had been built and waiting, and only needed the final trigger of discovery to start running. 4 months after I found the phone behind the shoebox, I loaded the last of my belongings into a rented van and drove away from the Moseley house for the last time. I didn't look back as I turned out of the street. I couldn't. The flat in Erdington was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a converted terrace, the kind of conversion that had been done cheaply in the 1990s and showed every year of it. The walls were the particular off-white of places that have been painted over too many times without being properly prepared. Walls that had absorbed years of other people's cooking smells and cigarette smoke and the specific damp that comes from inadequate ventilation. The carpet in the living room was a brownish grey that might once have been either colour. The bathroom extractor fan made a sound like a small animal in distress. I could hear my neighbour's television through the wall every night. Action movies, primarily, with the volume high enough that I could make out dialogue. For the first 3 weeks I lay in the dark, on the mattress I'd brought from the house, and listened to other people's stories playing out through the plasterboard, and I thought about nothing in particular, which is its own kind of terrible. I'd lost 16 pounds by December. Not from any effort or intention. Food had simply stopped tasting like anything I needed. I ate because I knew I should, standing at the kitchen counter with whatever I'd microwaved, unable to sit at the small table that had come with the flat, because sitting at a table alone felt like an accusation. Standing, it was just eating. Sitting, it was something else. But it was the mirror that broke me open in a new way, in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'd expected grief, I'd expected anger, I'd even somewhere expected shame. That particular male shame that comes from being deceived, from having been so thoroughly fooled for so long. What I hadn't expected was the blankness. I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror in the mornings, getting ready for work, and I genuinely, honestly couldn't tell you who was looking back at me. Not in a poetic sense, in an actual concrete sense. I could name the features, identify the face, but I couldn't locate in that face any coherent sense of self. Because here's the thing I'd never had to face before, the thing the placeholder comment had sliced open in me, like a scalpel. I had built my entire adult identity around being her husband, not secretly, not consciously, but completely. I was the man who was married to Caroline. I was the man who supported Caroline. I was the man who turned down the London job because Caroline didn't want to leave Birmingham. I was the man who spent his weekends at her family gatherings, his holidays at her chosen destinations, his evenings absorbed into her social world, her friendships, her needs, and her narratives. I had become so thoroughly grafted onto her life that when she cut away from me, she took all of that with her. And what remained was a 47-year-old man in a damp Erdington flat who did not know what he liked for breakfast when nobody else was there to consider. I called in sick to work 11 times in 2 months. I stopped answering my phone, except for the calls I couldn't ignore. My colleague Rachel texted to ask if I was all right, and I wrote back, yes, just a virus going around. And then I felt guilty for lying to someone who'd been nothing but kind, and I put the phone face down on the counter and didn't pick it up again for 3 hours. Rachel wasn't the only one who noticed, though she was the one who said something directly. There was a client meeting in January, 3 weeks into the new year, at the point where grief had settled from acute to chronic, from the dramatic falling of a roof to the slow damp spreading through a wall, where I lost the thread of what I was saying mid-sentence. I was explaining something about a pension consolidation, a routine piece of analysis I could have done in my sleep, and I stopped. And the client, a kind man in his 60s named Graham, who worked in civil engineering, looked at me with the politely alarmed expression of someone watching something break down that should be functioning. I found the thread again. I recovered the meeting, but I sat in the car park afterward for 20 minutes before I could drive. And the 20 minutes felt necessary in a way that frightened me slightly. I had told almost nobody the truth of what had happened. This wasn't deliberate secrecy. It was more like an inability to construct the sentence. Saying it out loud in the language of actual conversation required a version of it to exist in the world that I wasn't ready for. I'd told my sister Judith in a phone call in December, a conversation I'd rehearsed so many times that when I finally made it, I sounded almost clinical, like someone reporting a case study. She'd been horrified and kind and had offered to come up from Bristol, and I'd told her there was no need, that I was fine, that it was just a matter of sorting through things. And she'd heard the lie in it, but hadn't pushed, because that's who we were as siblings, people who gave each other the space we asked for, even when the space was the wrong thing to give. There was one night in December, a Wednesday, raw and cold. The kind of Birmingham December that feels like February tried harder when I drove to Moseley. I didn't plan it. I'd been sitting in the Erdington flat, listening to my neighbour's television, and the combination of the muffled action soundtrack and the off-white walls and the sound of the extractor fan in the bathroom doing its distressed animal impression had become so specific a form of unbearable that I simply got in the car. I parked on the opposite side of the road from the house. The lights were on in the front room with its bay window, the window I'd watched the first snow of every winter from for 14 years. There were 2 silhouettes moving behind the curtain. I sat there in the dark for perhaps 20 minutes, motor off, hands in my lap, watching the warm rectangles of light that had been my life, that now contained someone else's life, or the beginning of it. A man moved across the room. Marcus, I assumed, though I'd never seen him. And the silhouettes came together briefly before the curtain shifted and the light changed. I drove back to Erdington. I don't mention that to generate sympathy. I mention it because I think it's important to be honest about the degree to which the human mind struggles to let go of what it understands as home, regardless of the logic of the situation. I knew, rationally, that the house was not mine in any useful sense anymore. I knew that what I was doing, sitting outside in the cold looking at lit windows, was not helpful. But rationality and necessity don't always speak to the same parts of you, and that night, the part of me that needed to see what had replaced me turned out to be louder than the part that knew it was a bad idea. My friend Paul, we'd been friends since university, the kind of friendship that survives long gaps between contact because the trust is structural rather than dependent on maintenance, called me in January after Judith had clearly told him something, though he didn't acknowledge that when he called. He asked about football first, in the particular way men ask about football when they want to lead into something else. And then he asked if I fancied coming down to London for a weekend, his way of saying, I know something's wrong, I'm here. I went. I took the train on a Friday evening, and I sat in Paul's kitchen in Hackney while his wife Claire made food and their 2 kids argued about something at the table, and I felt the specific, strange comfort of being inside someone else's functioning life. Not envious, not exactly. Something more like reminded that domestic warmth could be real, that kitchens could be full of ordinary noise and cooking smells and small arguments about nothing, that this was what life actually looked and sounded like when it was working. I hadn't been sure of that for a while. Paul took me to a pub on Saturday afternoon, and we sat at a corner table with pints of something on a dark wood surface, and he waited. That's Paul. He's always known how to wait. And eventually I told him. The proper version, not the clinical one. The version with the bedroom floor and the Nokia and the message about 12 years and the house transfer I'd signed without reading. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which is not a skill everyone has. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment and then he said, Right, all right then. What do you actually need? Not what's polite or fine, what do you actually need? I said I needed to find out who I was without her, because I genuinely didn't know. He nodded. He said, Yeah, that's the work then. It was the most useful thing anyone said to me for a very long time. The depression didn't announce itself. That's what people don't tell you. It doesn't crash through the door. It seeps under it. Gradually, everything requiring effort becomes slightly more effort than you have. Getting out of bed requires a decision. Showering requires a decision. Making actual food rather than something from a packet requires too many decisions, so you don't. The grey November outside became the grey December outside, became the grey January outside. And I moved through it like something operating at reduced capacity, like a phone on low battery mode that can still function, but only for the most essential things. I was sitting in the flat on a Tuesday morning in late March when the letter arrived. I'd taken another sick day. I'd become creative about my sick days by then, spacing them to avoid the pattern becoming too obvious. I almost didn't open it immediately. I'd developed a slight aversion to official-looking envelopes for understandable reasons. But this one was from a solicitor's office in London, and something about that, the distance of it, the unexpectedness, made me open it at the kitchen counter rather than putting it aside. My great-uncle Walter Hartley had passed away at the age of 91. I had to sit down. I knew who Walter was, of course, in the way you know about relatives you've almost never met, a name that came up occasionally at family occasions, a face I'd seen perhaps 4 times in my entire life, most recently at my grandmother's funeral 11 years ago. He was her older brother. He'd never married, had lived alone in a cottage in the Cotswolds since before I was born, had led a life I'd never inquired into with any real curiosity because there'd never seemed to be any reason to. He was simply there, a peripheral fact of the family, until he wasn't. The letter informed me that Walter had named me his sole beneficiary. I read that sentence 4 times. A 3-bedroom stone cottage near Bourton-on-the-Water, an investment portfolio valued at 340,000. All of it left to me. David Hartley, who had met this man perhaps 4 times and had never exchanged more than a few dozen words with him in his life. The solicitor called me the following day to walk through the details. I was sitting in the flat's living room, the afternoon light coming weakly through the net curtains, and I listened to a man I'd never met explain why someone I'd barely known had changed everything. Walter, the solicitor, told me, had seen the divorce notice. Small papers still publish them. It's a legal requirement. And Walter apparently read them. He had investigated quietly, through means the solicitor didn't elaborate on. He had learned what had happened. 2 months before he died, he had redrawn his will, and he had included a handwritten note. The solicitor read it to me. His voice was professionally neutral, experienced at delivering significant information without editorializing, and I was grateful for that, because if he'd added any warmth to those words, I don't think I'd have been able to hold myself together. For David, a man deserves better than being someone's convenience. Build something real. I wept. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. I sat in the flat that smelled of damp and other people's cooking, and I wept for this man I'd barely known, who had seen me more clearly than I'd been able to see myself, who had looked at the wreckage of my life from 91 years of distance and decided that I was worth an act of grace, who had known somehow that I needed someone to tell me that I was worth something. Not with sympathy, not with pity, with a task. Build something real. He didn't say I was sorry for what happened to you. He didn't say you'll be fine. He said build. He said build something real. And somehow the expectation embedded in those words, the assumption that I was capable of it, undid me more completely than any expression of sympathy could have. It took 6 weeks for the inheritance to be finalized. 6 weeks during which I went back to work properly, stopped taking sick days, started eating actual meals sitting at the table. Something had shifted, not dramatically. I wasn't suddenly fixed, wasn't suddenly happy, wasn't suddenly clear about what came next. But I had a direction. I had a voice belonging to a 91-year-old man I'd barely known, telling me to build something real. And that turned out to be enough of a handhold. The cottage was beautiful. I drove out to see it on a Thursday morning in May, taking the day off work for the first time with actual purpose rather than avoidance. The Cotswolds in late spring have a particular quality of light that always surprises me, even knowing it, that golden specific English green, the stone buildings that look like they grew out of the landscape rather than being placed on it. Walter's cottage sat at the end of a lane near Bourton-on-the-Water, 3 bedrooms, exposed beams inside, a garden at the back that opened up to a view of rolling hills. It needed work. The kitchen was 30 years old. The bathroom needed updating. The garden had gone somewhat wild in the last year of Walter's decline. But the bones of it were extraordinary. I sat in the garden for a long time that day, in an old wooden chair I found in the shed, and I thought about Walter's life. He'd lived here alone for decades, apparently contentedly, had read the papers and kept investments, and somehow, from this quiet distance, had kept track of a great-nephew he barely knew well enough to recognize that great-nephew needed help. I wished I'd known him better. I wished I'd asked my grandmother more about him. I filed that regret away as something to carry gently rather than heavily, and I looked out at those green rolling hills and asked myself, for the first time in months, what I actually wanted. The estate agent who'd done the valuation had left a key, so I let myself inside after the garden had given me what it was going to give me that afternoon. The cottage had a particular interior stillness that I've come to associate with places that have been inhabited by solitary people. Not loneliness exactly, but a certain quality of density in the quiet, as though the rooms had absorbed decades of a single personality and held it in the walls. Walter's books were still on the shelves. He'd been a reader. The bookshelves ran from floor to ceiling in the sitting room, organized with a precision that spoke of genuine care, the categories clear: history, philosophy, biography, natural science, and an entire section devoted to what appeared to be local Cotswolds history. I ran my finger along a few spines. The books were well used. He'd been the kind of reader who kept paperbacks and didn't worry about the state of them. Spines cracked from multiple readings, certain pages dog-eared. On the desk in the small study off the sitting room, there was a notepad. Most of the pages had been torn out, but the top page had an impression in it from whatever had been written on the page above, the kind of ghost writing that remains when you've pressed hard. In the right light, coming through the study window, I could just make out letters, a name, my name. He had been writing about me, or to me before the will was drawn. He had been thinking about me, this man I'd met perhaps 4 times, with care and intention. I sat at his desk in his study in the stillness of that May afternoon, and I understood something that I haven't been able to articulate precisely before or since. That being known, truly known, accurately known, by someone who has no particular obligation to know you, is one of the rarest things in a human life. Walter had known me, not from time spent together or conversations had or history shared, from the specific quality of attention he'd paid to the world he'd been born into, from reading a notice in a local paper and caring enough about what it meant to do something about it. I found a photograph on the desk, tucked under the corner of the notepad. A young man standing in front of what I recognized as the cottage, though with younger plantings around it and a different gait. He was perhaps 30, square-shouldered, with a direct look at the camera that suggested he was the kind of person who didn't see much point in looking anywhere else. He was grinning. Not the posed grin of a photograph, but the real one, the kind that gets out before you can manage it. On the back, in small, neat writing, Walter, 1957. I put the photograph in my jacket pocket. It's still on my desk now, beside the note. The young man who would one day look out from his 91st year and see a great-nephew he barely knew and decide the boy was worth helping. He looks, at 30, like someone who was already the person he would always be. I find that reassuring, for reasons I don't entirely understand. 3 months later, I sold the cottage. I want to be clear, it wasn't an easy decision and it wasn't a quick one. There was a version of my life where I moved into it, made it beautiful, lived quietly in the Cotswolds, and healed slowly, and perhaps that life would have been fine. But the more I sat with Walter's note, build something real, the more I understood that he wasn't just talking about a place. He was talking about a life, an actual life, with purpose in it, with usefulness, with the specific satisfaction that comes from being genuinely good at something that matters. I didn't think that life was in a cottage, however beautiful. I thought it was in Birmingham, in the work I knew how to do. I combined the proceeds of the cottage with the investment portfolio, cleared what remained of my debts, which weren't catastrophic now that the divorce settlement had been paid, and sat down with a legal pad and wrote at the top of it, in capital letters, "Build something real." There was a financial planning certification I'd been interested in for years. I'd mentioned it once to Caroline early in our marriage, and she'd made a face. That particular expression she had for things she found unnecessary, a slight pursing of the lips, a quick dismissal. And I'd never mentioned it again, never pursued it. It had sat in the back of my mind as one of those things, the things you're interested in, but don't do because there's always something else. Because the life you're living doesn't quite have room for it. I enrolled in September, the same month I moved into a new flat in Harborne. Still affordable, still modest, but mine in a way the Erdington place had never been. The building was maintained, the walls were clean. The flat smelled of nothing in particular, which was a profound improvement. I painted the living room a deep blue that I'd always liked, and that Caroline had vetoed for our house on the grounds that it was too dark. and I stood back when I finished and felt a quiet, unremarkable surge of satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. It was the right color. I had chosen it because it was right, not because it was acceptable to someone else. That turned out to matter more than I would have guessed. I studied every evening, after work, after dinner, actual cooked dinner at the table with no excuses. I'd open the course materials and work. The certification was challenging in a way that felt like exercise feels difficult while it's happening, producing something afterward that you can recognize as an improvement. I was good at it. More than good, I found myself genuinely engaged in a way that I hadn't felt engaged in years, in a way that made the hours disappear rather than drag. I'd forgotten what that felt like. The complete absorption of being interested in something, of turning a problem over in your mind because you want to understand it rather than because you have to. There was one night in November, a Tuesday, exactly 1 year after I'd found the phone, though I hadn't planned the timing that way, when I almost stopped. I was working through a section on complex trust structures, the kind of financial architecture that wealthy families use for estate planning, and I hit a wall, not a conceptual wall, not a place where I didn't understand the material. A different kind of wall, the kind that has nothing to do with what's in front of you and everything to do with the question of why you're there. I sat at my desk in the Harbin flat at 11 o'clock at night with my course materials open and my blue walls and my actual furniture I'd chosen because I liked it, nothing more. And I thought, what am I building this for? Who is it for? When you've spent your entire adult life building for someone else, the question of what you're building for yourself turns out to be genuinely difficult. I knew the professional answer. For the business I intended to start, for the work that would be genuinely useful, for the financial independence that would make me genuinely free. But that's an answer about outputs, not about why. And at 11 o'clock on that particular Tuesday, with the anniversary of the worst day of my life ticking quietly past in the background, I needed the why. I sat with it for about 30 minutes without the course materials. Then I wrote something on the notepad I kept beside my laptop. It was a list, not organized, not categorical, just written as it came. The things I'd learned about myself in the year since the bedroom floor, that I was better at detailed financial analysis than I'd given myself credit for, that I genuinely liked helping people find things that had been hidden from them, information, clarity, money, all of it. That the satisfaction I felt when a problem resolved was the most real satisfaction I knew how to identify in my own experience. That I could, when forced to, live simply and find it not a deprivation, but a clarification. And then, that there were people in situations like the one I'd been in who didn't have the things I'd eventually had, who didn't have a Walter, who needed someone to sit down with them and look at their numbers and find what had been done to them and give them a path forward. That was the why. That had always been the why. I just needed the right night to see it clearly enough to write it down. I went back to the course materials. I finished the section. I passed the assessment the following week with the highest score in my cohort. The practice came together in stages, each one a little more real than the last. First the certification, then the business registration, a one-afternoon exercise in choosing the right name, which took longer than the registration itself because I understood that names matter more than people think. Then the accountant, a precise woman named Liz, who I'd been referred to through a former colleague and who looked at my business plan with the slightly skeptical efficiency of someone who has seen many business plans and approved very few, and who said, at the end of her review, "This is actually well structured, you might do all right." I'd rented the first office on a 6-month rolling basis, a single room in a shared professional space near the jewellery quarter, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall and a radiator that had 2 temperatures, often tropical. I'd furnished it with a desk, 2 chairs, and a small side table for the box of tissues I'd learned from one initial conversation with a potential client that this kind of work required. The room was 10 feet by 12. I was the only employee. My first 3 clients were referrals from former colleagues who knew what had happened to me and had enough trust in my competence to point people my way. Those first 3 clients taught me things about this work that no certification covered, that people coming through financial devastation, particularly divorce-related devastation, needed to be heard before they needed to be advised, that the numbers were never just numbers. They were the material evidence of something that had been done to them, and what they needed was someone who understood that, who could look at the numbers as a story told about a real person and respond to the story as well as the arithmetic. That sometimes the most important thing you could say in an early meeting was, "You're right to feel that something is wrong here. Let me look at it properly." I became, very quietly and over a fairly short time, extraordinarily good at that. I joined a gym in October. Nothing dramatic about that decision. I was walking past one evening. It was on my route. The membership wasn't expensive. And I thought about the 16 pounds I'd lost and the hollowness it had left in my face, and I went in and signed up. I didn't go with any particular plan. I just went a few times a week and moved my body through space in ways that reminded it of its own existence. The weight came back over the winter, but as something different this time, denser, more purposeful. I'd lie in bed at night and feel the specific tiredness of a body that had actually been used, and it was the best kind of tired I knew. Rachel at work commented in February, a few months into my new regime, that I looked alive again. She said it the way people say things they've been thinking for a while and finally decide to say, slightly too casually, with a small emphasis on the word alive that told me she'd been watching and worrying. I thanked her and meant it, and then I stood in the corridor for a moment after she'd walked away and thought, she's right. I do. I am. I completed the certification in April, 7 months after starting, and I was brilliant at it. I say that not from arrogance, but because the results said so, and more importantly because I knew it from the inside, the way you know a fit of a thing that actually fits. I was brilliant at it in the specific way that you're brilliant at something that uses what you actually are rather than what you're performing. And I had an idea that had been forming quietly through the months of study, fed by my own experience, by the particular shape of what I knew. I specialized. I built something specific, financial planning for people going through divorce and its aftermath. The kind of planning that addresses not just where the money is now, but how it got there, what was done to it, how to recover from what's been lost. The kind of planning, in other words, that nobody had provided for me when I needed it most. My first significant case, 3 months into my private practice, was a woman named Sandra, 53, recently divorced, convinced that her settlement had left her with less than she was owed, but unable to prove it. I spent 2 weeks going through her ex-husband's financial disclosures and found what she'd suspected. 18 tons. Zero, hidden in an offshore structure that his solicitors had managed to obscure in the paperwork. When I showed her the documentation, printed out, flagged, annotated, the whole thing laid out with accounting precision, she looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me and she started to cry. She wasn't crying about the money exactly, or not only, she was crying about being believed. About someone looking at her situation with care and diligence and coming back with evidence that what she'd felt was real. She reached across the desk and hugged me. I sat there in my small office, which I'd set up in a converted space near the jewelry quarter, not far from where I'd worked for 20 years, but mine now, every inch of it. And I let her, and I thought about Walter's note. Build something real. This was real. This moment, this woman, this work that was genuinely useful to someone who genuinely needed it. I felt something settle into place in my chest, something that had been rearranging itself for over a year, and it settled into a shape I recognized as belonging to me. Sandra came back 3 months later, after the legal process had run its course, and her solicitor had used my documentation to reopen the settlement. The additional 18 Julusans, once the court had seen the offshore structure properly laid out, became 26 Julals with interest and costs. She sat across my desk and slid an envelope toward me and said, "This is separate from your fee. This is because you gave me my life back." She said it very simply, without drama, in the way people say things that are simply true. I took the envelope and said thank you, and meant it. After she left, I sat for a long time thinking about what she'd said. Not the money, though the money mattered practically, as the practice was still early enough that every client outcome had direct significance for whether I could pay the rent on the office. What I thought about was the phrase, "gave me my life back." What it meant to receive that. What it told me about the person I was becoming, someone whose gifts, whose particular combination of skills and personal history and hard-won knowledge could do that for people, could sit across a desk from someone at the worst intersection of their financial and emotional life and be genuinely useful there. Not performatively, not as a role, as the actual, complete, present version of myself. I had never been that person when I was Caroline's husband. I had been good at my work, yes, but the work had been a function, a means to an income, a respectable dimension of a life whose center was located somewhere else, in her, in us, in the structure of an identity that wasn't built from my own materials. This was different. This was David Hartley, who knew what it felt like to have money taken and a house signed away, and a life dismantled, putting that knowledge in the service of people who needed it. This was mine. I want to tell you about the moment I heard about Caroline's life, not because it gave me pleasure, though I'd be lying if I said it gave me nothing, but because of what it confirmed about the invisible mathematics of consequence, the way that what we do accrues interest, positive or negative, in ways we don't always notice until the accounting comes due. It came through mutual friends, the few who'd remained genuinely connected to me through the divorce, the ones who'd chosen friendship over social convenience. Marcus, it turned out, had made his money in the first place through a tech company valuation that had been, to put it charitably, optimistic. The company had looked spectacular on paper, the kind of paper that attracts investment, but the underlying model had never been as solid as the presentation suggested. 14 months after Caroline and Marcus had begun their public life together, the company collapsed in the specific way overvalued startups collapse, suddenly, loudly, with nowhere to hide. He lost nearly everything. The luxury apartment they'd been renting in the mailbox, the area along the Birmingham canals where the upmarket restaurants and bars sat polished and gleaming. That apartment disappeared when Marcus couldn't make the payments. But it was worse than that, because Marcus's ex-wife, the woman he'd left before Caroline, had launched legal action claiming he'd hidden assets during their divorce. The claim was legitimate, as it turned out, and the case was brutal and very public. Caroline's name appeared in court documents. Marcus's finances were turned over in open court. The judgment came in at 190,000 dollars against him, money he no longer had. I heard they'd moved into his mother's house in Solihull, the woman who had looked at me across our kitchen table and called me a placeholder. The woman who had spent years planning her escape to a better life, living in her boyfriend's childhood bedroom at 45 years old. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be precise about this. What I felt was more complex than that. A kind of sorrowful recognition of how completely she had misunderstood her own situation. She had looked at her life with me and seen an obstacle, a temporary inconvenience between her and something better, and she had torn it apart with extraordinary efficiency. And then The something better had turned out to be built on the same kind of paper-thin foundation as everything she'd left. She'd traded solid ground for what looked like solid ground from a distance. I saw her once during that period, at a distance, in Birmingham city centre on a Saturday afternoon. She was coming out of a shop near New Street Station, and I was on the opposite side of the road, and she didn't see me. She looked diminished. Not unkindly, I'm not trying to be cruel, but genuinely, visibly diminished. The grey had come through at her temples in a way she'd clearly stopped managing. She walked with a heaviness I didn't recognize in her, a slight shuffle that spoke of exhaustion carried for a long time. The elegance she'd always had, the particular way she held herself, that quality of effortless presentation that had been part of who she was for as long as I'd known her, had thinned like paint on a surface that's been weathered. I stood on that pavement for a moment after she'd passed out of sight. I felt something, standing there. Sadness, actually. Genuine, quiet sadness for someone who had traded something real for something that looked real, who had made decisions from a place of so much certainty and had discovered that certainty doesn't protect you from consequences, that planning for the outcome you want doesn't guarantee the world will deliver it, that sometimes the life you tear down was the right one and you don't know that until it's too late to go back. I didn't want her back. I want to be clear about that. The sadness wasn't longing. It was something more like grief for a version of things that might have been if she'd been different. If I'd been different, if we'd been honest with each other in the ways we weren't. It was the sadness of waste, of potential ruined by choices. I turned and walked to my car and drove back to Harborne and made dinner in my clean, quiet flat and ate it at my table and felt, all things considered, that my life was very good. It was 2 years after the divorce was finalized when she came to my office. I want to describe this scene carefully because it's one I've replayed many times, not out of any satisfaction in her difficulty, but because of what it required of me. The particular quality of presence and restraint it demanded from the person I'd spent 2 years becoming. My practice had grown. I had 3 employees by then, a junior analyst named James, an office manager named Priya, and a financial planner I'd brought in 6 months earlier named Tom, who was excellent and who I'd poached from a larger firm by offering him the specific kind of work that larger firms don't do. We'd moved to better offices near the jewelry quarter. I had a real office now, with a glass door and a view of the street below, and a small sofa for clients who needed to sit somewhere other than directly across a desk when they were talking about difficult things. I'd co-authored a guide on financial recovery after divorce. 7 months of work, publishing it through a small press that had been enthusiastic, and it had sold 200 copies, which in the world of financial guides is genuinely not nothing. I was, in other words, no longer the man she had dismissed. I was sitting at my desk when Priya came in to tell me that a woman was asking for an appointment. She gave me the name, and I sat for a moment, very still, very quiet. I told Priya to send her in. She walked through the glass door and I stood up, because I always stand up when a client enters, and I gestured to the chair across my desk, and she sat down, and I sat down, and we looked at each other across 2 years and a great deal of distance. She looked tired, not broken. She still had the fundamental structure of herself, the dark eyes and the precise way she held her hands in her lap, but tired in a way that had become her baseline rather than a temporary condition. She was wearing a grey coat I'd never seen, and she'd done her hair carefully for this meeting, and I recognized in that careful presentation the particular effort of someone who knows they are at a disadvantage and is trying to narrow the gap. She said my name, David. She said it the same way she'd always said it, and something in me heard that and then set it aside. I waited. The office was doing its best job of being what it had been designed to be: calm, professional, orderly. The afternoon light came through the window behind me. There were 4 framed prints on the wall, 2 architectural photographs I'd found at a Birmingham market, and 2 maps, one of the Cotswolds and one of the city, because I'd decided, when I was designing the space, that it would say something about where I came from. Priya had brought in a small plant that sat on the windowsill and had somehow thrived entirely without my attention. On the wall to my left, Walter's note. I was aware in those first seconds of all of it simultaneously: the room, the light, the framed note, her face across the desk, and something else. A kind of internal inventory, the sort that happens automatically in situations of high stakes. I checked myself for anger and found none. I checked for grief and found something old and settled, nothing urgent. I found, with some slight surprise, that what I felt most clearly was professional, the particular calm, focused quality of someone in a context where they know exactly what they're doing and why. She explained. The legal judgment against Marcus, 190, Suzerain, his earning capacity currently essentially nil, her own resources, the divorce settlement, the 40 thries, a zero of my savings she'd taken, all of it, gone faster than she'd expected. She'd used the phrase lifestyle inflation without irony, which told me she'd been reading about her situation, trying to understand it in intellectual terms, which is what people do when the emotional terms are too painful. She had rehearsed some version of this. I could tell, not from the words, but from their rhythm. A slight over-smoothness in the transitions, the kind you get when you've practiced something enough to take the edges off the worst parts. She explained that the apartment had gone, the car, the accounts. She explained that Marcus's litigation was ongoing and that she was named in certain aspects of it by association, which meant her own financial picture was complicated by legal uncertainty in ways she couldn't fully untangle without professional advice. She said his name matter-of-factly, Marcus. 4 times in perhaps 3 minutes. Each time, something in me registered it and moved on. Not nothing. There's no pretending it was nothing, but nothing that required managing. Nothing that pulled at anything live. The wound she'd made had healed into something that was simply scar. Not painful, just there. She looked at me near the end of her explanation, with an expression I recognized as the closest she could get to asking for something directly. She had never been good at asking for things directly. She'd always been better at creating conditions where people wanted to give them to her. I had spent 14 years being a person who wanted to give things to her, and now she was sitting across my desk in an office that hadn't existed when she left, looking at a man who had used the ruins of what she'd done to build something that, by any objective measure, was considerably more than what they'd had. She would pay my consultation fee, she said. Something in the room was very quiet, not uncomfortable, just quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something significant is about to be decided. I thought about the bedroom floor, the Nokia, the 8 sentences. I'd been sure for years. I'd thought about the Erdington flat and the off-white walls, and the extractor fan and the 16 lost pounds. I thought about the night I'd sat outside our old house in the dark, watching lit windows, containing a life that had been mine. I thought about Paul asking, "What do you actually need?" and the extraordinary simple honesty of being asked that by someone who meant it. I thought about Walter. For David, a man deserves better than being someone's convenience, and I arrived at the answer with total clarity, from a place of complete steadiness, not from anger, not from the satisfaction of refusal, from the simple, well-founded knowledge of what was mine to give and what was not. I looked at her. I breathed. I thought with extraordinary clarity about who I was and who she was and what I owed to each. And I said calmly, in the voice that 2 years had built for me, in the voice of someone who knows his own worth, because he had to reconstruct that knowledge from the ground up, "I'm fully booked for the next 3 months. But I can refer you to a colleague who might have availability." She heard it. I watched her hear it, watched the understanding move through her face, the slight flinch, the recalibration. She heard what I wasn't saying as clearly as what I was, because that's the thing about people who've hurt you. They know the grammar of your restraint. She knew that I was choosing not to help her. She knew that the man sitting across this desk in this office that hadn't existed 18 months ago was making a decision, clearly and deliberately, to place a boundary between her need and his gifts. She nodded slowly. She started to rise. At the glass door, she paused, and people do this, I've noticed. They pause at doors because a door is a threshold, and some things need to be said at thresholds. And she turned back. "I made a terrible mistake," she said, quietly, simply. "Yes," I replied, "you did. But that's not my problem anymore." She left. I heard the outer door of the office close behind her. I sat in my chair for a moment, in the quiet, and I noticed that my hands were steady. I noticed that my chest felt clear, not tight, not weighted. I noticed that I felt exactly myself, not performing restraint, not suppressing rage, not grinding down grief. Just myself, steady and clear, in a life I had built with my own hands. I picked up my phone and called the colleague I'd mentioned, Simon, excellent at his work, whom I genuinely thought could help her. I left a message briefly flagging that someone might call. That was the extent of my involvement. I wish her no particular harm. I just don't owe her anything. Those turn out to be completely compatible positions. The karma finished completing itself through the following year in the quiet, unglamorous way that consequences tend to complete themselves in real life, not with dramatic announcements, but with accumulated weight. Marcus's legal position deteriorated further. The court judgment against him had grown with interest and costs, to a sum that would take years to clear if he managed to earn enough to clear it at all. Caroline had sold the jewelry, the car, the things that could be sold. I heard from a former mutual friend, someone who'd stayed tangentially connected to both our circles, that she'd developed stress-induced hypertension and was managing it with medication. 3 different medications. I heard they were still together, she and Marcus, though the word together had lost whatever warmth it once contained. 2 people who'd detonated their previous lives for each other, who'd planned and schemed and waited and executed their plan with precision, now living in his mother's house in Solihull and discovering that the thing they'd burned everything to reach hadn't been what either of them believed it was. There's a particular kind of bitterness in that specific situation, not just the loss of what you had, but the loss of the alternative you chose over it. The thing you bet on didn't pay out, and you can't go back, and you chose this. Those 3 facts inhabit the same space, and that space is very small and very airless. I felt the sadness of it when I thought about it. I didn't permit myself to feel the satisfaction, not exactly, because the shape of her situation wasn't really about me. It was about choices and their consequences, which is a truth that applies to everyone, including me. I'd made choices too. Some of them had been terrible. I'd chosen to trust someone completely without ever verifying that the trust was warranted. I'd chosen to sign documents I should have read. I'd chosen to build my entire identity around another person until I had no independent structure left. I owned those choices. I'd had to. The difference, and I think this is the difference that matters, was what I'd done with the wreckage. She'd stood in the wreckage of a life she'd built on someone else's collapse and found that the new foundation was as weak as the one she'd undermined. I'd stood in the wreckage of a life that had been taken from me and built something new, from materials I chose, with a blueprint I drew myself. I still have Walter's note framed on my office wall. Not prominently. It's on the wall to the left of my desk, where I can see it when I look up from my computer, small and unassuming in a plain dark wood frame. For David. A man deserves better than being someone's convenience. Build something real. Clients sometimes notice it and ask about it, and I tell them it was a gift from someone I barely knew who saw me clearly when I couldn't see myself. Most of them nod in a way that suggests they understand more than they're saying. I started hiking seriously about 18 months into my recovery. A colleague mentioned a group that went out on weekends. Nothing extreme, just people who wanted to be in hills and fresh air, and I joined without overthinking it, which was itself a small revolution. Because the old me would have thought carefully about whether he wanted to commit to a group activity before he had enough information to be certain. The hiking group turned out to be one of those unexpected gifts that come without announcement. There were 8 of us who went regularly. A retired teacher named Barbara, a civil engineer in his 30s called Sam, a nurse named Diane, who walked like someone who'd been doing this her whole life, and 4 others whose occupations I learned slowly over months of shared sandwiches in exposed places, and shared bad weather decisions, and shared conversations that had the particular ease of conversations held while moving, when neither person has to look at the other directly, and the landscape does some of the work of holding everything. I'd never had friends like that in my married years. What I'd had were Caroline's friends and the husbands of Caroline's friends, and colleagues I was cordial with, and Paul, dear Paul, who'd always been there but at a distance I'd allowed to open because I'd been absorbed. The hiking group was mine from the beginning. I'd found it, I'd shown up. Nobody was there because Caroline had put them there. The first time up Snowdon, the weather turned on us at about 2/3 of the way up. Clouds dropping in from the west with the sudden decisiveness that Welsh mountains specialize in, and by the time we reached the top, we were walking in a whiteout. Visibility down to about 10 meters, the summit cairn appearing suddenly out of the murk like a joke. We stood there, soaked and slightly frozen, and Sam made tea from a thermos, and Diane said, "This is brilliant," and Barbara laughed, and I stood there in that cold, invisible place thinking, yes, this is exactly the right place for me to be right now. I've climbed Snowdon twice now. The second time in better weather than the first, and I stood at the top in October sun with my lungs working and the view stretching out in every direction, Wales and its hills and its tremendous sky. And I thought about that man sitting on a bedroom floor in November with a shaking phone in his hands, and the distance between that man and this one, at the top of a mountain, feeling his own body and his own presence and his own life as entirely his own. The second time, the October one, I went alone. The group had planned a different route, but I'd wanted Snowdon specifically, for reasons I couldn't fully explain. I drove up on a Saturday, parked at Penny Pass, walked the pig track in autumn stillness. The mountain was quiet, a handful of other walkers spaced far enough apart to feel solitary. The summit was clear, the sky that particular Welsh October blue that doesn't exist anywhere else, and the view was extraordinary. Anglesey to the north, Cardigan Bay to the west, the Snowdonian peaks ranging away in every direction. I sat on a boulder near the summit and ate my lunch and thought about David Hartley on a bedroom floor in November, and I felt, in a way that I'd been moving toward for 2 years but had never quite articulated, the full distance I'd travelled. Not just the practical distance, not just the business, the flat, the certification, the book. The internal distance. The specific distance between a man who had no self-independent of someone else and a man sitting on a mountain in October in clean air with his lunch, belonging entirely to himself. That's a hard thing to earn. I want to say that clearly. It is not a gift, or a consolation, or a silver lining. It is the result of 2 years of specific, effortful work, the work of deciding who you actually are when the identity you'd built has been stripped away, the work of choosing one small choice at a time, the things that were genuinely yours rather than performed or inherited or settled for, the blue walls, the certification, the gym, the hiking group, the cottage photograph on the desk, the practice and everything it stood for, choices that accumulated over time into a self. And then I stood up and walked back down the mountain, It's a strange thing to be grateful for your own devastation, and yet I started dating again, carefully, about 2 years after the divorce was finalized. Carefully is the precise word, not reluctantly, not cynically, but with a quality of attention I'd never had before. Because before I'd never had to think carefully about who I was in relation to another person. Before Caroline, I'd been young and unformed, and love had been a feeling I fell into without examining the ground. With Caroline, I'd been so completely absorbed into her orbit that I'd lost the capacity to distinguish my own preferences from hers. After Caroline, I had to learn something I should have known from the beginning, that love, to be worth anything, has to begin from two complete people, not two halves, not one whole and one placeholder. Two complete people who choose each other from a place of fullness rather than filling an absence. I'm still learning that. I want to be honest about that. I haven't arrived at some perfected version of self-knowledge, but I know the difference now between choosing from fear and choosing from strength. And I know which one I'm capable of, and that matters. There was a woman I met through the hiking group, not Barbara or Diane, someone who joined later, a secondary school teacher from Edgbaston named Claire, who had her own version of a difficult few years and wore it the way people wear things when they've decided the wearing is finished. We'd gone for coffee after a walk along the Malvern Hills in the rain, the kind of walk that ends with everyone's boots saturated and nobody minding because the conversation was good and the hills had been themselves regardless of the weather. She'd asked me, over a pot of tea in a cafe that smelled of wet coats and cake, what I'd lost that had been hardest to rebuild. I'd thought about it properly before answering, not the polished answer, the honest one. I said, the belief that I was real to someone, that I existed for someone in a way that mattered, the belief that I was seen. She'd held her mug in both hands and looked at me with the particular quality of attention that means someone is genuinely present, and said, "And do you have that now?" And I'd had to sit with it for a moment because it was the right question and it deserved the right answer. I said, I'm working out how to have it without needing it to come from somewhere else first, which is different from what I was doing before. We've been together 8 months. I'm still learning how to be in something without disappearing into it. She is patient with my learning in the way of someone who has done their own version of the same work. That turns out to be the thing I'd never known to look for. Not someone who makes you feel complete, but someone alongside whom the work of being complete feels possible and worth doing every single day. The practice keeps growing. I've spoken at 2 conferences this year on financial recovery and divorce planning, and I've been approached about a second guide, more specific, more technical, that I'm considering. James has become genuinely excellent at the work, and I suspect I'll be making him a partner within the year. Tom has brought in 3 major clients through his own network. Priya runs the office with the particular efficiency of someone who has absolutely no tolerance for disorder, which means everything runs on time and nothing gets lost, which is the professional gift I'd never known I needed. I look in the mirror now, and I know the man looking back at me. I know what he likes. The deep blue walls, the hills on a weekend, the specific satisfaction of finding the number in a spreadsheet that explains the whole story. I know what he values, honesty specifically and usefulness, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't require you to disappear. I know what he won't tolerate. Being convenient, being someone's placeholder, being so absorbed into someone else's life that he stops having one of his own. That knowledge, that specific hard-won knowledge of self, that's Walter's real gift, not the cottage, not the portfolio. Those were the material conditions that made rebuilding possible. But the note, for David, a man deserves better than being someone's convenience. That note told me what to build toward, a life where I was real to myself, where my value didn't depend on someone else's assessment of it. where the man in the mirror was someone I'd chosen rather than someone I'd ended up. Build something real. I did. Not just the business, not just the bank account recovered. I built a self, a life, an identity made entirely from my own materials, standing on ground that belongs to me, shaped by choices I made because I understood my own values well enough to make them. And nobody can take it from me because it's not located in anyone else's story. It's mine, wholly, completely, irreducibly mine. If I could sit down with the man on that bedroom floor in November, that man with shaking hands and a Nokia he'd never seen before, a man about to have 8 words set his life on fire, I'd tell him this: you're going to fall. Not metaphorically, actually. The ground is going to come up to meet you, and it is going to hurt in ways you don't have language for yet. You are going to lose things you thought were yours, and some of those things you can't get back, and that's true, and it's terrible, and it's also not the last word. The last word is that sometimes the fall is the favor. Sometimes what you needed all along was to lose the wrong life, so you'd have room to build the right one. Sometimes the people who replace you are doing you the kindest possible thing while meaning to be cruelest. They are clearing ground. They are making space. They are ending a story that needed to end so another story, the real story, your story, can finally begin. And sometimes, while you're building that story, a 91-year-old man you barely knew reads a notice in the local paper and sees the truth of who you are and leaves you what you need to start. And the only thing he asks in return is that you build something real. I did. I am. What David's story reveals is something that research into identity and life transition confirms in striking terms. Studies in post-traumatic growth, a field of psychology developed by researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina, consistently show that a substantial proportion of people who experience significant personal crises, including divorce and financial catastrophe, report meaningful positive change in their lives as a direct result. Not in spite of the crisis, because of it. The mechanism appears to be identity disruption. When we lose the narrative frameworks through which we understood ourselves, we are forced, often painfully, sometimes catastrophically, to construct new ones, and those new narratives, built from actual self-knowledge rather than inherited role or social expectation, tend to be more authentically ours, more durable, more genuinely satisfying. Psychologist Carl Jung wrote that what you resist persists, and what you face transforms. David didn't choose his fall. Nobody chooses to find a phone behind a shoebox on a November Saturday and discover that their life was someone else's waiting room. But he chose, in the aftermath, to face everything. The grief, the depression, the terrifying blankness of an identity built entirely around someone else. He sat with all of it, and he faced it, and it transformed him. Not into something he wasn't, but into something he more fully was. The placeholder remark did something the woman who said it never intended. It forced David to answer, with his entire rebuilt life, the question of what he actually was. The answer turned out to be extraordinary. Not because extraordinary is the destination of all suffering. It isn't, and we should never romanticize pain. But because he chose, with intention and effort, and Walter's note on his wall, to build towards something worth building. If any of what David went through resonates with something in your own story, I hope you hear this. You are not a placeholder. You were never a placeholder. You are the whole story. If David's story moved you, hit that like button right now because it helps this channel reach people who need to hear this more than they know. And I want to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered something that rewrote the story you thought you were living? Have you found that your lowest point turned out to be the doorway to something better? Tell me, because those conversations matter, and this community shows up for them in ways that constantly surprise me. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is absolutely the time. Hit that button and the bell so you never miss a story. And genuinely, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? I love knowing that these stories are landing in sitting rooms and commutes and kitchen tables across the world at every hour of the day and night.